Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our session today. I am Dr. Holly Pope, and I am a lifelong teacher, but right now I am a postdoc with Immerse Games.
And I'm Lindsay Trofe. I'm founder and CEO here at Immerse Games, and a privilege to have Holly working with us right now.
And before we move beyond representation, first I'd like to acknowledge that yes, representation in games is important. I have a personal story in my recent past that illustrates why representation matters. As a research assistant on a project examining math learning in digital games, I was tasked with finding digital math games that could be used to develop and assess deeper learning in mathematics. The content of the games is a discussion for another day, but let's just say that we were looking for something that would inspire deeper problem solving and choice making patterns in the players. I downloaded this particular game, and after your name, you have to choose your avatar. The designers recently updated this page to eliminate choosing a binary gender, which is a step in the right direction. However, it's still represented in the character choices. And while I do identify as female, I don't identify as white. So my only choices were to play the game as a white man or a white female. And maybe I was feeling extra sensitive that day, but I closed the game. At that point, I didn't even access the math learning in the game because this game assumed that the only people who would play it would be white males or females. And if they weren't, they wouldn't care to choose one or the other. But I did. A few weeks later, because I was curious about the math learning in the game, I opened the app again and I found more issues with it that attacked other parts of my identity. As you level up in the game, your character not only changes to become more aesthetically pleasing according to Western beauty standards, but also your character takes on different jobs or roles, starting as a farmer and then a blacksmith, and as you level up, moving closer to the castle until you are the king or queen. What message does this game send about race, class, and gender? This is why representation matters. Games need to be culturally responsive. In recent years, representation in games has improved. More characters of various shades, cultures, and styles can be found in most games on the market. This is a step in the right direction of cultural responsiveness. But what is cultural responsiveness? As a framework to guide our work, we borrowed from the NYU Metro Center. They designed a culturally responsive curriculum scorecard that we've used to inform our work with digital games. It's made up of two components. One component of cultural responsiveness is representation. Diverse representation in terms of who is in the room during the conception and the design of games. Having diverse creators increases diversity of thought and approaches to what is created. Going back to my personal experience with the math game I mentioned earlier, my guess is that the creators of that game have a binary view of gender, probably don't associate much with people of other races, ethnicities, or cultures, and they're probably from mid to upper level socioeconomic backgrounds. Representation also includes diversity of characters and avatar choices. And as I mentioned previously, the industry is improving in this area. This also includes, in terms of abilities, diversity in terms of abilities, gender fluidity, and body types. We still have a ways to go in the industry in that area. Finally, it also includes accurate portrayals. Having diverse authors and creators leads to accurate portrayals of diverse characters that don't feed into stereotypes or narrow conceptions of culture. Characters should accurately reflect the histories and experiences of their cultures, recognizing that because people are multidimensional, characters should also be. However, cultural responsiveness is more than just diverse representation. What's often overlooked in game design is the social justice component of cultural responsiveness. This includes decolonization, power, and privilege by including non Eurocentric ideas and cultures. Contributions, knowledge, and philosophies of other groups are centered, which leads to multiple perspectives. And this affirms, values, and sustains the worldviews of historically underrepresented people. And finally, connecting learning to real life and action by encouraging players to connect to experiences beyond their own, examine their own perspectives and privilege, and to develop a critical consciousness about systems of oppression in order to take action against them. This is important for all people. And for Lindsay and I, this includes the type of content you include in the game. Does the game foster deeper learning or does it center on memorization and rote procedures? Marginalized children have long been denied access to opportunities to develop deeper learning and higher level thinking. Does the game provide opportunities for deeper learning or does it perpetuate existing inequities? So, to sum up, cultural responsive games include elements of representation and social justice. Not every game can include every component, but we need to be more intentional about incorporating cultural responsiveness in games. This is important because cultural responsiveness improves connection to the content, increases motivation and engagement, and improves learning as a result. Since games are starting to improve on representation, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay to share examples of games that include the social justice components of cultural responsiveness.
Okay, thanks, Holly, for that great framework and really setting the stage for how we should be thinking as game developers about doing this in our work. So, as Holly mentioned, I'm going to go through some examples because we really wanted to talk through some, actual solid examples of how these concepts can be applied to help you see that. So, first, we're going to start actually with some other games that we respect from other people, and then walk through some examples from the game we've been working on and that Holly's been helping us with for this last year and a half. She's been with us here. So the first example we wanted to look at, sorry, I'm bouncing too many multitasking now, is a game called When Rivers Were Trails. During this game, you play as an indigenous person in the 1890s. When you start, your land has been chosen for allotment to settlers, and you must leave before they arrive and could harm or kill you. And so you have a choice in the game, you gather a few supplies, and you have to run. Then, as the game progresses, you work your way out west. You're trying to survive, you're trying to find a new home. And so, as I mentioned, this is much like Oregon Trail, but set in this type of environment and from indigenous perspectives. So, what I really love about this game and looking at it is on the way, you encounter many people from various indigenous tribes and learn their stories. The entire game and many of these stories really focuses on that concept that Holly mentioned of decolonization, power, and privilege. So all of our examples are going to really be worked around these concepts that she just talked about. So for example, in this game, we're looking at resources and power. We're of course questioning the atrocities that happen in our US history. So, for example, in this screenshot here, you stand with a tribe who pushes back about their land being taken, and you get opportunities to make these decisions throughout the game, which are really powerful for you as a player. In another example, the game is also highlighting strengths and assets of marginalized people, of the tribes being featured. So, for example, in this screenshot, the game is pointing out respecting your elders. It gives you opportunities to listen to their stories, to give food and medicines, which often increases your well being in the game mechanics and lets you really experience a little bit of what these cultures are like. Another example, the game introduces you to a person with a concept that we now refer as to being two spirit. Again, to learn and respect the strengths that we're seeing across these different cultures and highlighting those assets in terms of thinking about power and privilege. Of course, in this process, they're also centering multiple perspectives. One thing that's amazing about this game is they worked with over 30 indigenous creators from multiple communities. And it's been really essential. You can see it in the work. So, that type of work and centering many perspectives, you saw that in the previous examples, but I also love the one in the screenshot. So, as you're playing the game, you encounter an indigenous person who actually took up an offer from land from the settlers and chose to work with them. And so, you as a player can choose to disagree with them. And it's also important when we're thinking about centering these perspectives that we show these differences within a community, especially in marginalized communities. So we're not turning them into some sort of stereotype or shallow representation of what these communities really are, which are full of unique individuals and people. We need to also acknowledge that in this type of work. So, for another example that's deep in a different way and a little more fun and less depressing, well, okay, maybe not. When we get to the examples, there's Mullet Industria, which is a self titled democratic socialism simulator. So, it's a site with a bunch of interesting social justice oriented games. So, we're going to look at two of the examples really fast here that I got to play around with and really appreciated. So, for the first example, many of them connect real life and action. That's why I wanted to pull these out. So they have something called the McDonald's video game. It is a parody where you run the chain and you're trying to grow it and increase profits. So in the process, you end up having to maybe cut down forests, bribe politicians to keep workers' rights lower to reduce your costs, feed your cows inappropriate feed so you can increase their production and make sure you have enough hamburger patties and more. Honestly, I kept accidentally bankrupting them, which was concerning since I'm actually the CEO of my own company. But the point here is they're really exploring concepts around the environment, around workers' rights and health issues when you look at massive corporate production and putting this all into the actual mechanics of the game in a really interesting way to let you think about those real life actions and explore the impacts. Another really interesting example on that site is called A Short History of the Gaze. And this is about the relationship between gaze and violence. It's a VR experience. They called it more like an essay. It goes from evolution of sight in Precambrian sea creatures to a dominance display of a primate. When you look at the monkey in or the primate in this experience, it reacts and has this dominance display, a landscape of billboards that you're looking at, or interacting with people in an elevator. And the player affects the scenes by simply looking or not looking. And I found this interesting because of being able to tie it into these perspectives and experiences, especially from marginalized groups where gays can be threatening, and being able to connect your own actions to understanding that perspective and what that might mean with how you should interact with communities out and about in the world. And now for our last example is the game my company creates and Holly's been working on with us, Title Online. So you wanted to include this as an example because the two that we looked at from other creators, which we massively respect, were definitely designed very explicitly around these concepts of social justice. But you can work these concepts into games that aren't created kind of specifically around these social justice concepts like those examples. So, people like us are making standards-based STEM games and we can incorporate these right into that content, make it culturally responsive and have social justice. So that's something that we've been diving into a lot more over the last year. So our game, Title Online, is made for middle school students to learn around the next gen science standards and STEM skills. They create a character and go into an alien planet, and they're doing all sorts of quests and activities that help them learn science. So, of course, first, a key part of what we've done is we do have representation. I know we titled this talk Beyond Representation because we wanted to go deeper than that, but we do have diverse creators. We have the opportunity for diverse characters that the players can create in the game. And within the game itself, we've included characters from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, characters with disabilities that are neurodivergent, that are LGBTQ, that come from non traditional family structures. All of that is just wrapped into the game and the experiences you already have. And again, these are not being represented as tokens, they're full characters. This is a single part of their identity. For example, on the right side of our screenshot here, we have Councilwoman Nassim, who has her awesome sci-fi wheelchair, and that's just, a part of who she is within the game and the roles she's playing. But to us, of course, this representation is kind of the bare minimum. So we've also been incorporating more social justice concepts and getting deeper on what we can do. So let's walk through those. So, first is how we think about decolonization, power, and privilege, and focusing on the assets of marginalized people. So I know I just included like a lot of screenshots here, but I was trying to kind of include some to show off a storyline that we've created where a nurse helps you run experiments to figure out how to stop the spread of a new epidemic. Might be inspired by some real life scenarios, but in this case, you're sneezing and having a rash. And so the nurse is looking at intake forms, running experiments with you, and figuring out what we can do to really slow down the spread of this and more people don't get sick. So, of course, we're featuring diverse characters as part of this representation, but importantly, we're showing out assets of marginalized people. We're showing, for instance, that everyday people are solving problems and holding important knowledge. Our nurse works in a free clinic and is solving problems for her community. It's not just a PhD level epidemiologist in a white lab coat that's doing science in a disconnected theoretical way. And in fact, you as a student are helping to solve these problems. So this power is really put around, decentralized into people that are solving important problems out in the community. And this is something we're working to get better at and taking more perspectives and how we can really express some of these concepts as well. So, in another example, we're looking at centering multiple perspectives. So, to learn about genetics and actually mutations, we take the example of a track star that you're working with named Arthur, who has sickle cell anemia. He doesn't realize it at first. He comes to you because he's been feeling sick after practice, and you go through a series of investigations and you figure this out with him. And through that process, he's talking to you about the impact. And he also wants to look at his family, since African American communities in the US are much more likely to have sickle cell. And so we were able to really explore what that meant for him and his family and those outcomes. And after we released this, we were thrilled to have a middle school science teacher say his kids were relating to the psychological aspects just as much as the science, and it provoked student driven discussions. And for one last example, for incorporating real life in action, for us to teach basic genetics, we have you work with a botanist connecting food scarcity and how we can help the community have more food. So the councilwoman wants you to work and try to figure out how to increase crop yield. You run selective breeding programs, you do experiments on water and light levels. We really here have focused on showing the social impact of STEM because that's critical to engaging marginalized students. And research, for example, shows that girls who, have tend to drop off in STEM interests in middle school if they're going to lose it, want a career that help people, but they don't think that's engineering. Now, if you ask them, do they want to be able to grow more food, solve hunger, clean water? That's really interesting. And so this is something that we're really excited to incorporate into a lot of our science work. So, to wrap up here and talk a little bit about some resources and future direction. First, we did put together a folder of resources for you all. So, if you go to bit.ly, so bit.ly/responsive games, this will direct you over to a Google Drive folder that we put some resources in. And so, as Holly mentioned, we use some resources from NYU, for example, with some scorecards here. A lot of them are made more for kind of whole curricula, but they've been really helpful for us to guide our thinking and figuring out how we can incorporate these concepts and what we can really do about that. Or, of course, if you're an educator watching this, not a game developer, using that as a guideline to help you understand what you could be looking for in games and curricular resources to incorporate more of these culturally responsive concepts as well. In close, we want to encourage more work in the space from those of us that are designing learning games. Curriculum isn't really strong in supporting all students unless it's responsive, including our supplemental curriculums that we're making when we create learning games. And video games, of course, are a culturally relevant platform, but we'd love to see this cultural responsiveness emerge as a strength of the game based learning community and how educators can address these needs. We're capable of making incredible work here to incorporate representation, but also to move beyond that and include these social justice concepts in the work that we do. We know that this is challenging. It does require extra resources and time. Some good first steps are, looking at the resources we shared, getting feedback for the community you serve, and of course, hiring diverse team members to have some of those varied perspectives baked into your team from the beginning. So thank you guys so much for joining our talk. Holly and I are going to be heading over to the Imagine Q&A room after this. So if anyone wants to keep talking about ideas and learning from each other, we'd love to have some more discussion there. Thank you.
Thank you.